Public policies to deal with externalities. Okay, we've been studying externalities and how the person doing the consumption or production only worries about their personal costs or benefits. They produce or consume too much of the good that produces negative externalities and too little of the good that produces positive externalities. And we've seen that this, with the externalities, the market comes to the wrong or inefficient level of output. So how can we get people whose behavior produces negative externalities to produce or consume less? And how can we get people whose behavior produces positive externalities to produce or consume more? That's what we're going to talk about today. And there are three basic methods that have been used in public policy to deal with this problem. The first is let people work things out amongst themselves. The second is use laws and regulations to force markets to the right or at least a better level of output. And the third is use market-based solutions to create incentives for the appropriate behavior. Okay, let's start with that first idea that people can work out these problems for themselves. For economists, this idea is based on something called the Coase theorem. It's named for an economist named Ronald Coase, who was a very famous Nobel Prize-winning economist who lived about 100 years ago. And the Coase theorem goes as follows. First, assume that property ownership is clearly defined, the number of people involved is small, and that bargaining costs are small. If these conditions are met, then people will be able to reach a negotiated arrangement to deal with externalities. Let's see how that would work. Simple example here. Your neighbor puts up really elaborate tacky Christmas tree displays every year. You tell him that his displays keep you awake at night. He says that your barking dog keeps him awake at night. He agrees to turn off his lights at 11 p.m. and you agree to keep your dog inside at night. Here we have a negotiated solution to a two-sided externality problem. Another example, and this is a real-world example. A factory blankets nearby housing with ash. Private investors buy the housing, and then they pay off the factory to stop producing the ash. So here we had a party that took ownership of the housing and used their resources to stop the factory from producing the ash. Privately arranged solution. But there are limitations to the ability of the Coase theorem solutions to deal with externalities. That is, there's a limit to the ability of Coasean bargaining, as economists call it, to work. First is the payment may be too expensive. Outside private investors had to buy the housing to finance paying off the factory to not produce ash. In fact, studies have found that there's a high rate of pollution in low-income neighborhoods. These people probably don't have the financial resources to pay nearby polluters to stop polluting. Secondly, there are frequently many people involved in a situation involving externalities, and bargaining amongst a large number of people can be expensive. Economists call this high transaction costs. That's the high cost associated with the process of negotiating a mutually beneficial solution to a problem. Then there's the problem of it may not be clear who owns the property being affected and who can bargain for it. Remember that we said that one of the conditions for Coasean bargaining was that it had to be clear who owned the property. Well, who owns the clean air and who gets to bargain on its behalf? Who gets to bargain on behalf of all the children affected by asthma? Who actually owns the particulates that go into the air? It's very hard to solve these problems. So it's very hard to reach a bargaining solution to these types of problems. And if you take these problems and you stretch them out to a higher level, you can think about how some problems would be absolutely insurmountable to solve using Coasean bargaining. For example, global warming. This is a problem that affects people all around the world, African farmers, owners of coastal vacation homes in the US, and hundreds of thousands of other people. How could they all get together to pay off the parties producing greenhouse gases without any role for government? How could you even deal with all the parties producing greenhouse gases? Everyone who drives a car? It really seems like this is a problem that you couldn't solve through a negotiated settlement through private parties. Okay, here's sort of a corollary to the Coase theorem, that we can use the court system. Somebody produces negative externalities, take them to court. If we structure liability laws appropriately, we can use the courts as a vehicle to coordinate action against externalities. For example, lawsuits against private polluters, or you can even use nuisance laws to sue your neighbor for producing noise or other problems. However, there's still a problem with using the court solution. Going to court is very expensive. And if one person does it to stop someone from producing a negative externality, all the other people nearby suffering from the problem will also benefit. So notice that we've just created a new externality problem. There's a positive externality associated with filing a lawsuit, but other people benefit from that lawsuit. So there'll be underproduction of lawsuits, too few suits going after polluters. Well, one way you can deal with that is through something called a class action suit, where everyone affected joins together in a suit. But there's another level of transaction costs associated with these type of suits. Courts have very strict rules for when a class can be legally recognized, and it's very hard to organize a class to deal with these multi-party lawsuits to go after polluters. Okay, so there's some problems with trying to use private solutions. Let's look at laws and regulations discouraging or prohibiting behavior. And notice we're bringing the government into the problem now. Okay, first there can be local laws and regulations that are set up by counties, by cities, even by neighborhoods. You can have, for example, private covenants, where neighborhoods associations don't allow those tacky Christmas decorations or set rules on how much noise you can make. You can also have zoning laws. These are laws that are passed by city governments that, for example, don't allow industrial activities in residential neighborhoods, so people don't have to deal with a factory right next door. Sometimes however, they don't allow things like construction of high density housing to protect property values of people who are already in a neighborhood. This is called the NIMBY problem, which stands for not in my backyard. And as those of you who've started working on the paper know, this is one of the factors that's contributing to the housing problem in the United States. There are too many zoning regulations, make it too hard to build new housing, particularly high density rental housing, and this is making it hard for there to be enough housing in the country. Okay, so let's talk about national level laws. This would be something like the Environmental Protection Agency laws and regulations that stop people from or control levels of pollution. Sometimes these laws require industries to install certain pollution controlling equipment. That's referred to as a command and control regulation. An example here is something called scrubbers, which are pieces of equipment that factories are required to put on their smokestacks to scrub out the pollutants. Or sometimes the government may set an allowed level of pollution, like automobile emission controls, or monitoring water table pollution of the water table around landfills. The downside to these types of regulations is that you're imposing a solution rather than letting the firm or industry work out the least cost way of doing things. It's probably better to set levels of pollution that are allowed than to mandate particular technologies. But either way, it may be hard for political authorities to work out the right solution. What level of solution should you allow? What's the appropriate level of emissions? These are hard questions to work out. A similar solution is to tax production that creates externalities. Recall that we showed last time that if a producer does not take pollution costs into account, too much of the final good will be produced. So if we put a tax on the price of that good, we can get people to produce and buy less. The pro side of this is that it allows firms to figure out the lowest cost of way of doing things. The con is that it's still hard to figure out how big the tax should be. Likewise, we can subsidize people to get them to consume more of a good that produces positive externalities. We can offer free vaccinations for low-income households, or for all households for that matter. And during the pandemic, if you remember, some states offered cash payments to people who came in and got inoculated. So those are examples um, of subsidies that are offered to people to get them to do something with a positive externality. Likewise, government grants are offered to install energy-saving equipment because using less energy reduces a lot of externalities. And a law was recently passed that granted subsidies to people installing solar power to try to deal with greenhouse gases. A third solution is something called pollution trading rights. This is a completely different approach where each firm is given the right to produce a certain level of pollution with a total level of pollution, which is the total based on the total level of pollution you want. And firms then are allowed to trade amongst themselves so that firms that can reduce pollution most efficiently do so. And others that for whom it would be more expensive can buy the right to avoid pollution abatement. The pro of this solution is that it's the most efficient way of reaching an outcome, rather than just telling firms what to do. The con is that people living near the firms buying the right to pollute will suffer. And if you set up the market wrong, it can go haywire. So we can see that all these solutions have pros and cons, and dealing with negative externalities and positive externalities is quite difficult.